Hi everyone, my name is Peter Cap and welcome to Peter's No Cap History, the show where I combine my loves of history and fantasy to give points of inspiration for aspiring fantasy artists, writers, and world builders. This is a follow-up to my previous video that talked about knights, and I mentioned at the end of that video that I was going to make another video that was going to talk about other cultures' equivalents to knights and armored warriors of such. If you want to have a type of heavily armored cavalry warrior or something like that that isn't a knight, which could be useful for if your fantasy setting is supposed to be like evocative of a different period or like a different region than medieval Europe. I want to make one thing clear before I get into examples though. If you just want to use knights regardless of the region your fantasy story is inspired from, or if it's inspired by a region at all, that is of course up to you. I believe that anyone can do what they want with their fantasy stories. However, I personally believe in the idea that we need to normalize other cultures' equivalents of these things to make the fantasy genre eventually more all-encompassing, than more than just Western European-inspired stuff. I believe we need to normalize other things, and this is my way of trying to encourage that. I'm not going to spend too much time on each example here. I will not claim to be an expert on many of these other kinds of warriors. I just know they exist and know enough about them that I think it would be interesting. And again, these are knight equivalents. The comparison's not going to be a perfect one-to-one, but I feel like that ultimately makes it more interesting as well. The first region we're going to talk about, which is pretty straightforward and probably the easiest way to transition from stuff that's similar to knights into stuff that's not quite as much. The first example I'm going to mention is samurai. I don't feel like I need to elaborate why, right? Samurai, I think out of all the examples on this list, are very much almost like a one-to-one. They are elite warriors as well as nobles, and just like knights, there's different periods that will affect the kinds of gear that the samurai will have. Just like knights, they were specialists in many kinds of weapons. I should also note that unlike knights, who typically use bows and arrows in hunting but not in warfare, samurai use bows in battle, as well as guns. And this is part of the appeal of going with other cultures. They often use different weapons than knights. Of course, samurai have the katana, the nodachi, I apologize if I mispronounced that, palm weapons like the naginata. It's very specialized if you're doing something with a Japanese style fantasy, but I feel like it's something worth mentioning. Now, as I go with the other examples, I should note there are 2 or 3 metrics for what I consider to be a knight equivalent. 1, they have to be an elite mounted warrior, and also sometimes infantry. 2, they have to serve the similar function in society as a knight, which is basically like a wealthier kind of individual. And believe it or not, those 2 categories aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So the next kind of warrior I'm going to talk about probably could have a video in its own right, the cataphract. Cataphracts are often seen as one of the precursors of the knight, and a lot of cultures had their own cataphracts, which had some slight differences over time. For example, the Parthians, which sounds similar to the Persians, but technically it's a different group. The Sassanids had their own cataphracts. The Seleucid Empire, which is actually a Greek kingdom. The Seleucid Empire was a successor state of Alexander the Great's empire, and as you can see here, it covered a lot of the Middle East. While there was a lot of Greek stuff, there was a mix of a bunch of different things, and cataphracts are one of those examples. The Romans gradually took up the idea of cataphracts and just cavalry in general. 2nd and 3rd century Romans had their cataphracts. The later Byzantine stuff, which technically they still call themselves Romans by the way, they had cataphracts too. You know what I mean? And again, very much a precursor to the knight. They were heavily armored, their horses were heavily armored. Just like the samurai example, some of these guys also use bows and arrows, which again gives you a little bit more options for weapon types than a knight would. We're actually not done with the Middle East. There's actually a good amount of examples to talk about here. As we go on to the Middle Ages as contemporaries of the knights, we have several examples to talk about, and this is why I made it clear that just because they have a heavily armored elite warrior doesn't mean they're necessarily the one-to-one equivalent of a knight. A tradition that was in many of these places in the Middle East was the Faris. I'm going to call him Faris, F-A-R-I-S, because the actual word, which is going to be on screen here, I'm not even going to try and pronounce. This was a practice of horsemanship and fighting amongst rich landowners in many of these regions, pretty comparable to the knight. But there's also another kind of soldier type that we need to talk about here. So I'm going to tweak the wording of this so that TikTok doesn't get its panties in a twist. Glaive Soldiers. Swap out the G with an S. There was actually a good amount of glaive soldiers in this part of the world too. The Mamluks come to mind. The Ghulams is another one, and the Janissaries are yet another. These are all Glaive Soldiers that were given the best gear so that they can do their job effectively. Pretty much any culture is going to have its elite warriors, and many of these are going to be on horseback or have some of the best gear that you can afford. If we're talking about like medieval Russia, for example, we have boyars, druzina, forgive my pronunciations, and again, similar type deal, elite warriors on horseback that have some of the best gear that that local region would have. I will say as a cautionary thing regarding some of these ones, especially the ones in the Middle East, make sure you do your own research. I do not claim to be a historian. I'm just a history buff, a passionate nerd. It would be wise to make sure that you are avoiding doing anything too stereotypical. In terms of other just casual mounted warriors, some other stuff I want to mention that just looks cool. Like, I don't think these necessarily have a special term, or at least anything other than Lancer. But like here we have the Cumans, which is a steppe people. Like there's a multitude of steppe peoples that have their own elite horsemen. The Mongols comes to mind, as you can see here. If you want to go back a little bit further, the Huns. You have a lot to work with here with a little bit of creativity. And again, it doesn't have to be like a one-to-one either. So you can take some of these ideas and still make your own culture with it. The tradition of Lancers and dedicated heavy cavalry could be traced as far back as like the Assyrians, which again we're talking about like late Bronze Age at that point. But yeah, so that's basically it. Again, this is a very broad overview. Obviously, you should do your own research. I hope this gets the creative juices flowing for you to consider other ways to go about things other than the knight. I will see you guys next time.